The garage smelled the same at 2 a.m. as it did at noon. Motor oil and cold concrete, and something underneath both of those things that didn't have a name. The scent of a place where a man had spent years working on problems he kept to himself. Cal Harper sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in the middle of that smell, elbows on his knees, a piece of paper in his hands. Not reading it. He had long since stopped needing to read it. He held it the way you hold something you are afraid of losing, which is differently from the way you hold something you treasure, though sometimes those are the same thing. The paper was a gas station receipt from a Chevron off Route 50. The ink had faded to near nothing in places, but Cal knew every word by heart. The handwriting was Jesse's, hurried, slightly tilted the way Jesse wrote everything, like his hand was always trying to catch up to his thoughts. The message was 4 lines. Cal had folded and unfolded it so many times that the creases had gone soft, the paper worn thin at the intersections, almost translucent. He folded it now along those same tired lines and pushed it back into his wallet behind his library card, and a photograph of Nora that was 2 years old and already looked nothing like her. He set the wallet on the workbench beside a stack of legal pads covered in equations and went back to work. The workbench ran the full length of the garage's east wall. 3 years ago, it had held the ordinary inventory of a working mechanic: torque wrenches, brake caliper tools, oil filter wrenches, a coffee can full of zip ties he'd been meaning to sort since the previous administration. Now it held something else alongside all of that: anatomy texts with cracked spines, printed journal articles with paragraphs circled in red pen, a human skeleton model missing its left foot which Nora had repurposed for a school project and never fully returned, calipers of 3 different sizes, a corkboard above the bench pinned with photographs of joints, hip joints, knee joints, ankle joints, alongside printouts of patent filings, stress diagrams, and one photograph of Jesse, taken at Folsom Lake the summer he turned 22, grinning with a fishing rod in his hand and absolutely nothing to show for a full afternoon of fishing. Cal never moved that photograph. It was the fixed point. Everything else on the board rotated around it. He pulled a fresh legal pad and started writing. Not because there was something new to figure out, because writing was how he thought, and at 2 in the morning there was nothing else left to do. His handwriting was nothing like Jesse's. Deliberate small letters, close together, the handwriting of someone who had learned to conserve space. He had almost been an engineer. 2 years into the program at Berkeley, close enough to the end of sophomore year, that the classes had started getting genuinely interesting. The kind of interesting that makes you realize you've chosen correctly. And then the world rearranged itself in one night and he never went back. He didn't think about it. There was nothing useful on that road. What he thought about, in the way that thoughts don't ask permission, was Nora. 7 years old and sleeping in the back room on a cot he'd set up when she was 4, because she had gotten into the habit of wandering out to the garage in the middle of the night to check on him. And after a while, he had stopped trying to discourage it and started keeping a cot nearby instead. She was out there now, one arm hanging off the edge of the milk crate she'd dragged next to the cot, and claimed as a side table her spiral notebook of brace designs open across her shin. She had been working on them for 3 months. Full schematics in crayon, with detailed annotations he couldn't always read. Last week's design had featured the notation, "extra comfy padding, maybe velvet." Cal had photographed it without telling her. He thought about Jesse. He did this every night, the way you return to a sore tooth with your tongue, not to cause pain, but because the absence needs checking before the rest of you will stand down. Jesse had been 24 when the motorcycle went down on a wet stretch of road outside Sacramento. The surgery that might have saved him had a price tag of $250,000. Cal had spent 3 weeks trying to reach that number through every channel he could locate, selling the truck, selling his tools, selling the good camera he'd bought himself for his 30th birthday and used exactly twice. He'd come up short by $60,000, which sounds like a manageable gap until you understand that $60,000 is not a manageable gap when you have no more things to sell. Jesse had died on a Tuesday. Cal did something good on every Tuesday now. It had started as a private ritual, the thing you do because the alternative is doing nothing, and doing nothing with grief is its own slow damage. Over time, it had become structural load-bearing. He fixed Mrs. Alderman's porch steps. He spent a Saturday morning helping the Kowalczyk kid build a wheelchair ramp for his grandmother. He sat with Walt Grady 3 doors down for 2 hours every other week, listening to Walt talk about the gulf in his hip and the particular indignity of needing a cane at 76 when you had once been the kind of man who didn't need anything from anybody. Walt's cane was one of the things Cal had been turning over on the workbench for the past several months, alongside a problem considerably more complex. He looked at his notes, looked at the corkboard, looked at Jesse. 3 years ago, when the idea had first taken shape, not an idea, exactly more like an obligation that had been waiting patiently for him to catch up to it, he had started with library books. Biomechanics of Human Movement, 2nd edition. Introduction to Orthotics and Prosthetics, a textbook on rehabilitation engineering that cost $42 used, and which he'd read cover to cover twice the second time with a highlighter. He'd found journal articles online, printed the relevant ones, built a filing system that had initially been alphabetical, and was now organized by the logic of his own investigation, which was harder to explain to anyone else but made complete sense to him. He hadn't talked about any of it. Not to Walt, not to Ruth next door, who brought food at odd hours and asked no questions, which Cal had come to understand was its own form of care. Not to the rotating cast of regulars who brought their vehicles through and sometimes stayed to talk real talk, the kind that has weight while he worked. Not to Nora beyond answering her questions when she asked them, which she did with the focused intensity of someone who suspects that adults are keeping the interesting parts to themselves. He hadn't talked about it because talking made it something that could fail publicly. The private version, 3 years of work that never amounts to anything beyond marked up paper, was a cost he could absorb. The public version was a different calculation entirely. He turned off the overhead light at 3:30 and went to check on Nora. She was asleep with her notebook still open, one page showing a new design she'd labeled the butterfly, for reasons she hadn't explained. He closed the notebook, moved it to the milk crate side table, and stood there for a moment in the dark listening to her breathe. He was 38 years old. His hands looked 20 years older, scarred at the knuckles from metal and heat, and the occasional failure of judgment. His wife had died bringing Nora into the world. He had come home from the hospital, sat in the kitchen for a long time, and then driven to campus the following Monday to officially withdraw. He had not cried at the enrollment office. He had not cried until 3 months later in the garage alone for approximately 4 minutes, after which he wiped his face and went back to the engine he was rebuilding. He was not a man who talked about himself. He was a man who fixed things. He went back to the workbench and worked until 5. October in the Bay Area is a negotiation between seasons that neither side wins cleanly. Tuesday arrived the way Tuesdays arrive now, with a particular quality of obligation that Cal had come to understand was not a burden, but a compass. He opened the garage bay at 7, made coffee in the machine with a cracked carafe that he kept meaning to replace, and started on Mrs. Alderman's alternator, which had been failing in the specific gradual way that things fail when they've been marginal for a long time, and finally encounter one demand too many. Nora came out at 7:45 in her green sweater, 2 sizes too small. She'd had it since she was 5 and refused to stop wearing it on the grounds that it was her favorite, with her ponytail listing 10 degrees to the left and her sneakers on the wrong feet. She was carrying a piece of toast in one hand and her latest notebook in the other, and she arranged herself on the milk crate with the efficiency of someone who has a system. Cal looked at her the way he always looked at her, which was first with his eyes and then with something deeper and less articulable. She was 7 years old and already entirely herself. He hadn't done anything deliberate to make her that way. She had simply arrived that way and kept being that way, which he found more astonishing than anything he'd built on the workbench. She held up the notebook. I added a hip rotation component. Her voice had the particular confidence of someone presenting findings to a peer. The old design was ignoring the rotation. I think that's a problem. Cal looked at the drawing. The hip rotation component was represented by a small spiral she'd drawn in purple crayon with an arrow, and the annotation, rotates here, important. He studied it for a moment with the same attention he'd give anything on the corkboard. You might be right, he told her. She looked satisfied, not the way children look when they've been praised, but the way they look when they've been believed. She went back to her toast. The morning passed in the usual way. 2 oil changes, a brake job on a Honda that had been overdue for a year, a conversation with Doug Merritt about the transmission in his F-15. Oh, that involved the word unfortunately more than once. Cal worked steadily the way he did everything, focused, economical, comfortable in silence. The way you get comfortable in a space you've lived in long enough. It was 12 minutes past 2 in the afternoon when he heard it. Not the car first, the sound of it, a Rolls-Royce Phantom at the wrong kind of address, a wrong note in a familiar song. Then the engine went quiet, and then there was a different sound, which was the sound of a woman getting out of a car, with her phone already in her hand, already talking, her entire posture radiating the specific tension of someone who has not stopped moving fast enough to catch up to the fact that she has stopped moving. Cal came around the side of the Civic he was working on and looked. She was 34 years old, though he didn't know that yet. White suit without a mark on it, which is either a superpower or an insult to the nature of Tuesdays. Blonde hair pulled back with a severity that seemed like a choice rather than a style, the kind of choice that says something about the relationship between control and anxiety. She introduced herself while her phone was still at her ear. Bridget Ashton, CEO. The title delivered like it was part of her legal name. Her daughter stayed in the car. Cal noticed this the way he noticed most things, without comment, with attention. The car was idling with a faint tick that suggested the real problem wasn't what had caused the stoppage, but was something downstream from it, and he filed that away while Bridget explained in precise and well-organized sentences that the navigation system had routed her here, that this was not her preferred situation, and that she needed the car evaluated and returned to function as efficiently as possible. He nodded once and moved toward the car. He was halfway around the hood when the passenger door opened and Sophie Ashton guided her wheelchair to the edge of the door and transferred into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times and found no reason to be dramatic about it. She was 15 years old, brown hair long with the kind of weight that hair has when it hasn't been cut in a while. Eyes that were darker than they needed to be for someone her age, not sad exactly, but carrying something. The expression of someone who has stopped being surprised when things go wrong and reorganized around that fact. The wheelchair was a good one, which is to say it was expensive. $12,000 at minimum, Cal's eye told him. The brace clamped around her legs was a different category of expensive. The matte carbon fiber chassis, the articulated joint housings, the Promotion Corp logo embossed at the hip, with the discreet confidence of a brand that considers itself beyond needing to advertise. He knew the logo. He knew the model number. He had spent 18 months studying this exact device in this exact configuration, and the recognition moved through him like something cold. Promotion X7. The same model Jesse had been fitted with in the 6 weeks before the accident, in the period when he was recovering from an earlier knee surgery, and the doctors had been optimistic, and Jesse had been Jesse making plans, buying a new rod for the fishing trips he kept promising they'd take, talking about what came next. Cal had studied the X7 not out of abstract academic interest, but because it had been in Jesse's life in those final months, and understanding everything about that period of Jesse's life was the only form of control Cal had been able to locate in the aftermath. He was aware of Bridget's phone and Bridget's posture and Bridget's complete assessment of this garage as a location that was beneath her practical needs, let alone her preferences. He was aware of all of that, and he set it aside. He crouched down, not entirely a partial crouch enough to bring himself to approximately Sophie's eye level, without performing the gesture. He looked at the brace. Not at Sophie, not yet. At the brace the way you look at something you are trying to understand before you say anything about it. The right hip joint housing, the angle of the lateral strap, the contact points at the thigh and the lower leg. He had the stillness of someone running calculations while everyone else expected small talk. Sophie was watching him. Her expression had not changed, but her hands had tightened slightly on the wheels of her chair. Cal looked up at her. "Does it hurt?" The question came out quiet, without preamble, without the softening that people usually insert around questions like this. When they ask them to 15-year-olds, the tilted head effect, the lowered voice of a person who believes they are being gentle but is actually being careful about their own discomfort. This was a direct question because it was a real question. He needed the answer. Sophie looked at him. Something shifted in her eyes. Not hope. She had learned to be careful with hope. He would understand that later. More precise than hope. The look of someone who has just been asked a real question and is recalibrating, because real questions from strangers don't happen often at 15. "Every single day," she said. Bridget had lowered her phone by a millimeter. Cal straightened up and went to the driver's side of the rolls to pop the hood. The car had a failing auxiliary belt tensioner. He identified it in under 4 minutes. And while he worked, he was also working on something else, running the geometry of what he'd seen in Sophie's brace against the 3 years of data on his corkboard, against the specific misalignment that had been nagging at him for 6 months, the one he hadn't been able to fully articulate in the legal pads. He was doing both things simultaneously, which was not unusual for him. He had always been able to hold multiple problems at the same time, running them in parallel, the way a processor runs parallel tasks, and it had served him well in the garage and made him difficult at dinner parties, or so he had been told. He straightened up from the engine compartment. Tensioner, 2 hours. Bridget had a response prepared regarding her schedule and the inadequacy of 2 hours within it, and Cal listened to all of it without interrupting. He had a response prepared regarding the physics of the tensioner and the absence of any alternative, and he didn't deliver it because it wasn't necessary. He just looked at her until she finished and said, "I can have someone drive you." She looked around the garage, the look of a person recalibrating the cost-benefit analysis of her situation. "We'll wait," she said, and walked to the office doorway and stood in it with her phone and her suit and her architectural hair. Sophie wheeled toward the garage entrance and parked there in the stripe of October light that came through the bay door. She had a book in the bag at the back of her chair, but she didn't open it. She looked at the workbench, at the corkboard, at the anatomy texts with their cracked spines, at the skeleton model missing its left foot. Her eyes moved across all of it with the methodical interest of someone who catalogs things. Nora appeared from the back room. Cal watched his daughter cross the garage with her notebook under her arm and her crooked ponytail and her absolute lack of any awareness that this was an unusual situation. She walked to Sophie's wheelchair and stopped in front of it and looked at the brace with the focused interest of a fellow specialist. "Does it hurt?" Nora asked. Sophie blinked, looked at Cal, then back at Nora. "Yeah, it does." Sure. Nora opened her notebook to the current design, the one with the hip rotation spiral and the extra comfy padding, maybe velvet annotation, and the purple arrows indicating load points she'd identified from watching Cal work. She held it up towards Sophie with the gravity of someone making a formal presentation. "I've been working on a better one." Something in Sophie's face changed. Not dramatically, she was a person who had learned to keep her expressions close, the way you keep things that have been hurt before. But the corner of her mouth moved and her eyes dropped to the notebook, and she studied it with an attention that was real rather than performed. "What's this part?" Sophie pointed to the spiral. "The hip rotation component," Nora said. "The old designs are ignoring the rotation. My dad says I might be right." Sophie looked at Cal. He was working on the tensioner and not looking at either of them, which was not the same as not paying attention. "Can I keep looking at it?" Sophie asked. Nora handed her the notebook without hesitation, which was the highest expression of trust in her vocabulary. Cal worked. Bridget stood in the doorway and did whatever Bridget did with her phone when she was waiting for a situation to resolve itself. The October light moved across the garage floor in its slow way. In the back room, the radio was playing something indistinct, the way garage radios always play present, but not demanding. He was aware of Sophie sitting in the light with Nora's notebook open across her knee, reading every page. He was aware of the X7 brace with its 10-degree misalignment at the hip joint. He was certain now the angle was wrong, had been wrong for however long she'd been wearing it, and the wrongness of it was the kind of wrongness that compounds over time, that the body absorbs in increments until the increments become indistinguishable from normal. Every single day, 11 years of that. He finished the tensioner at 4:14. He wrote up the invoice, which was fair, and brought it to Bridget. She paid without looking at the number, which told him something about her and something about the gap between their respective lives that he filed away without judgment. Bridget moved towards Sophie with the particular efficiency of someone resuming a prior trajectory. Sophie closed Nora's notebook and held it out, and then didn't let go immediately. She held it for one additional beat, looking at the cover, which Nora had decorated with marker drawings of various brace designs and the words "Nora's Invention Book" in uneven capitals. "Can I show you something?" Cal heard himself say. Bridget stopped. It was not a thing he had planned to say. It arrived the way certain things arrive, not from intention, but from a deeper layer of knowing that had been accumulating for 3 years and had finally reached a threshold. He was looking at the brace. He was looking at the 10-degree misalignment that he could see as clearly as he could see the tensioner problem he'd just fixed, as clearly as he could see anything mechanical, which was more clearly than he could see most other things. Bridget's expression was the expression of a woman who has been managed by confident men in garages before and has learned to wait them out. "The brace," Cal said. "There's a misalignment at the hip joint. 10 degrees. It's been loading the wrong contact points, which means every step she takes is working against the device rather than with it." Silence. Sophie had gone very still. Bridget's posture changed, barely visible, entirely legible. The tightening of someone who has just been told something she cannot afford to believe. "This device was fitted by a team of specialists," Bridget said. Her voice was the controlled voice of someone who has had a great deal of practice controlling her voice. "Promotion Corp is the leading manufacturer in I know who they are." Cal said it without heat. He crossed to his workbench and picked up the calipers. He looked at Sophie. "Can I show you?" Sophie looked at her mother. Then she looked at Cal with the dark, serious eyes of someone making a calculation of their own. "Okay," she said. He knelt beside the wheelchair. Not all the way down, he kept himself at a working height with the caliper, and he measured the hip joint housing against the angle of Sophie's pelvis with the focused precision of someone for whom precision is a native language. He showed her the number. He showed her where the contact was landing versus where it should land. He showed her the cumulative stress pattern on the carbon fiber housing where the force had been distributed incorrectly for long enough to leave marks. Sophie watched all of this without speaking. Her hands were flat on her thighs. Bridget had come 3 steps closer, despite herself. "Can you fix it?" Sophie asked. It was the real question, asked the same way Cal had asked his. Directly because it was a real question and she needed the real answer. Cal sat back on his heels. He looked at the brace. He looked at the corkboard where 3 years of work lived in organized rows, and at Jesse's photograph at the fixed center of it all. He thought about the 6 months he'd spent turning the ankle joint problem over and not yet solving it, and about the geometry of what he could do tonight versus what the problem actually required. "I can try," he said, "but it'll take time." Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression opened tentatively, the way you open a door you've kept shut because of what happened the last time. "I trust you," she said, simply without qualification, the way people say things when they mean them completely. Bridget's arms dropped a fraction. Cal stood. He looked at Bridget. "I'll need her measurements, and I'll need to know her full brace history, every device, every fitting the timeline." Bridget's phone was back at her side untouched. She was looking at her daughter, and her daughter was looking at the corkboard with Jesse's photograph at the center, and the afternoon light was coming through the one good window at the angle that made everything look like it was from a long time ago. "All right," Bridget said, and then after a pause she hadn't budgeted for, "Thank you." Cal nodded once. He went to the workbench and picked up his legal pad. They left at 5. Sophie handed Nora's notebook back at the door, and Nora received it with the solemnity of an exchange between professionals. Bridget did not look back. Sophie looked back once at the corkboard, and then she was gone. Cal stood in the garage and looked at the empty space where the rolls had been parked. Then he looked at his corkboard. Then he looked at Jesse. He thought about what he'd said to Sophie. "I can try. 3 years of work sitting in legal pads and anatomy texts and the battered corkboard, and all of it had been theoretical until this afternoon, which was the thing about theories, they can live indefinitely in the space between intention and execution, safe from the specific judgment of reality. He had now committed to reality. He had looked at a 15-year-old girl who had been in pain for 11 years and said he would try. He pulled a fresh legal pad and began. Nora came out at 6 with 2 pieces of bread and the last of the peanut butter and sat on her milk crate. She ate in silence for a while, watching him work. The radio had switched to something quieter. "She's been hurting for a really long time," Nora said. Cal didn't look up from the legal pad. "Yeah. Is her brace why? Part of why?" Nora was quiet again. She finished the bread and opened her notebook and started drawing. The garage settled into the particular piece of 2 people working in parallel, which is its own kind of conversation. At 8, there was a knock at the side door. Ruth from next door, 70 years old, house slippers on feet, that had decided some time ago that comfort was more important than appearance. She was carrying a dish towel wrapped around something warm, a casserole ceramic dish still steaming from the oven. She handed it to Cal without preamble, looked once at the corkboard, looked once at Nora. "My late husband had bad hips," Ruth said. Her voice was the voice of someone who has processed enough grief to speak plainly about it. "He spent the last 6 years in more pain than he ever told me about. I found out later." She adjusted the dish towel in Cal's hands. "Don't let that happen again if you can help it." She left before Cal had found the words for a response, which was probably deliberate. He set the casserole on the workbench and stared at it for a moment. Then he fed Nora, and when she'd fallen asleep on the cot at 9:15, he came back to the workbench and sat down with the full weight of what he was attempting pressing against his sternum. He pulled the wallet from his pocket, took out the receipt, unfolded it along its worn lines, and looked at Jesse's handwriting in the faded ink. "Help people like me. Don't let them lose hope." He folded it back up, put it away, and picked up the caliper. Prototype 1 began that night. He worked from memory. Sophie's measurements, the angles he'd taken with the caliper, the stress patterns in the carbon fiber that had told him where the forces had been going wrong. He worked through the anatomy of it, the load distribution, the geometry of the hip joint under dynamic conditions, which is different from the geometry at rest in ways that matter enormously when you're trying to build something that works in motion rather than standing still. He worked with the materials he had, which were not the materials he would have chosen if he'd had a budget and lead times in a supply chain. Aluminum stock silicone padding he'd ordered 3 months earlier for a project that hadn't had a name until now. Joint components he'd been machining in increments over the past year, filing them in labeled boxes on the shelf above the anatomy texts. The pieces were ready. The design was what required the night. Nora slept. The radio played. The fog came in from the bay and pressed against the garage's one good window. Cal worked until 2 in the morning, and then until 3. And then he looked up and saw Jesse's photograph and kept going. There was a version of this work that was mechanical, the accumulation of precise actions in a logical sequence. And there was another version of it that operated underneath the mechanical level that had to do with Jesse and with a girl in a wheelchair who had told him the truth when he asked. And with every Tuesday he'd spent doing something, because doing nothing was its own slow damage. He was making something. He didn't know yet if it would be good enough. He knew that not knowing wasn't a reason to stop. At 4:15, the first version of Prototype 1 was assembled on the workbench. He looked at it for a long time. It was rough. It would need refinement. The joint geometry was closer to correct than the X7s had been, but closer wasn't the same as right, and right was what he was after. He photographed it from 4 angles, made 6 pages of notes, and turned off the overhead light. He checked on Nora. She was asleep with her notebook open again this time, to a page that showed a design labeled The Hawk, with a note that said, "Faster response time." He stood there in the dark for a moment, listening to her breathe, thinking about how she had handed the notebook to Sophie, without a second's hesitation, the gesture of someone who doesn't yet know how to be guarded about the things she loves. He hoped she'd stay that way as long as possible. He sat down on the overturned bucket in the middle of the garage and looked at the workbench and at the corkboard and at the faint gray beginning at the window where the night was deciding to become morning. Jesse. He didn't say it out loud. He thought it with the particular weight of a thought that has a person's whole life behind it. He was 38 years old. His hands hurt. The good window was beginning to go gray. He got up and started coffee and went back to work. Prototype 1 was ready on a Thursday morning, 41 hours after Sophie Ashton had handed Nora's notebook back at the garage door and looked once at the corkboard before leaving. Cal had slept 4 hours across 2 nights, broken up the way sleep gets when the work won't pause, less rest than processing time. The subconscious finishing what the workbench started. He woke each time with something new to add to the legal pad, which he kept on the floor beside the cot, so he didn't have to cross the garage in the dark. Bridget had texted the measurements the night of their visit, a single message with Sophie's full brace history, attached as a PDF, 9 surgeries, 11 years of device records, every fitting logged with dates and practitioners and outcomes, the document organized with the precision of someone who has learned that paperwork is the one thing you can control when everything else requires other people. Cal had read it twice. The pattern in the data was visible once you knew what you were looking for, and now he knew what he was looking for. The X7 had been misaligned from the first fitting, Every adjustment since had been a correction applied to a foundation that was wrong, which meant 11 years of incremental compensation for a starting error that no one had caught because no one had thought to look at it the way Cal looked at things from the geometry outward rather than from the symptom inward. He had thought about calling that night to tell her. He didn't. Information without a solution wasn't something he dealt in. Sophie arrived with Bridget at 9 on Thursday. Bridget had cleared her morning, which Cal understood was not a small thing for a woman whose mornings were scheduled in 15-minute increments. She stood in the garage doorway with her coffee and her phone, watching differently than she had on Tuesday. Less management, more attention. Cal brought Prototype 1 to Sophie and explained what he'd changed and why before she tried it. He had decided at 2 in the morning that Sophie deserved to understand the mechanics of what was being done to her body. She had been experiencing results and non-results and wrong results for 11 years. Nobody had explained why. He showed her the joint geometry. He showed her where the original contact points had been landing versus where the revised ones would land. He showed her the load distribution diagram in his legal pad, the difference between the two designs illustrated in careful pencil. Sophie studied every page. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both exactly the right questions, about the silicone distribution and about the dynamic load behavior at walking speed. Cal answered them fully without simplifying and watched her absorb the answers with the focused stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for information she was always capable of understanding. Bridget had come 2 steps closer without appearing to notice she'd done it. The fitting took 30 minutes. Cal worked with the calipers and made 3 micro adjustments before he was satisfied with the contact points. Then he stood back. Sophie placed her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. She pushed herself to standing, the practiced motion of someone who has transferred between surfaces 10,000 times and took the weight on the new brace geometry. Her face changed, not dramatically, not the way it changes in movies where the moment of relief is unmistakable and large. It changed the way faces change when a constant low-level input that the nervous system has been processing as normal suddenly stops. A subtle recalibration, almost a confusion, the expression of a body trying to understand why something that has always been present is no longer there. She took 1 step. The sound of it on the concrete was different from what Cal had been bracing himself for, smooth, no catch the gate even. She took a 2nd step. Nora, who had been sitting on her milk crate with the forced patience of someone exercising a discipline she found genuinely difficult, detonated. The sound she made bounced off the ceiling and rattled the coffee cans on the upper shelf and arrived in the chest cavity of every person in the room as something between joy and relief, which are related emotions but not identical ones. Cal watched Sophie's face. Sophie was looking at her own feet with the careful attention of someone who doesn't trust good news yet. Then she looked up at Cal, and whatever she had been protecting behind the dark, careful eyes was briefly fully visible. Bridget had her knuckles pressed against her mouth, looking at her daughter the way you look at something you waited 11 years for and are only now letting yourself count the years. The garage held the moment for 3 full seconds. Then the ache came back. Sophie's expression shifted, the micro-tension around her left hip, the slight adjustment of her weight. She managed it quickly, well practiced, but Cal saw it, and Bridget saw it, and Sophie knew they both saw it. It was better. It was not right. Cal picked up the legal pad. The 2nd iteration came 4 days later. He had rebuilt the hip joint from scratch, revised the silicone distribution, and reworked the strap geometry based on Sophie's gait data. He'd set up his phone to film both test steps from 2 angles, and he'd watched the footage 40 times on the cracked tablet, mapping the force transfer frame by frame. The new design addressed everything the first one had revealed. He was confident in it, with the confidence that comes from having found the problem and solved it correctly, the clean satisfaction of a diagnosis confirmed. Prototype 2 broke on the 14th step. Not catastrophically, the joint didn't shatter. No one was seriously hurt, but the hip housing rotated under load in a way it was not supposed to rotate, and Sophie went down fast and hard onto the concrete floor with a sharp cry that moved through the garage like a blade. Cal crossed the distance in 4 steps and was on his knees beside her before the sound had finished echoing. Bridget was already on her feet. Her voice had gone somewhere flat and cold, The voice of a woman who has spent 11 years watching her daughter endure things and has finally reached the place where endurance ends and something harder begins. I am calling my attorney. This is finished. Sophie was lying on the concrete looking up at the fluorescent light, and she was not crying, which was the thing about her. She had cried all the crying out of this situation somewhere in the preceding 11 years, and what was left was something more durable than tears. She looked at her mother with the dark eyes and the careful expression, and she said one word, "Mom." Bridget stopped. Sophie's voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been through enough turbulence to find their own level. Every doctor we have ever hired failed us. Every specialist. Every team. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. The garage had the quality of a room where everyone has stopped breathing. He is the only person who has actually tried to fix what is wrong. A pause the length of several heartbeats. Please put the phone down. Bridget looked at her daughter on the concrete floor of a garage in Oakland at 11 in the morning, and the phone lowered slowly the way you lower something you've been gripping too long. Cal helped Sophie back into her chair without speaking. He looked at the failed joint housing in his hand. He knew immediately the mechanism had revealed itself under failure conditions the way mechanisms do. It wasn't the hip. He had been solving the hip because the hip was where the pain was, where the compensation was visible, where 11 years of bad load distribution had deposited all of its evidence. But the hip was downstream of the real problem. He stood very still, holding the broken housing, running the geometry backward from the failure point. The ankle. It was so clear once he had it that the frustration arrived immediately. All the evidence had been pointing there, and he'd been looking one joint too high. 3 years of solving the wrong problem. Every prototype he'd built had been addressing a symptom. The source was lower and quieter and had been doing its damage for 11 years without anyone thinking to look there. He was still working through the implications when the laptop on the workbench lit up. He almost didn't look. He was mid-calculation, the geometry unfolding in the legal pad in his mind, and the laptop notification was a peripheral event in a moment that didn't have room for peripheral events. But Sophie had pulled herself to the workbench on her way back to her chair, and she was the one who had opened it, and what was on the screen stopped the calculation entirely. A video call connecting. A woman appeared on the screen, mid-50s, silver hair cut, practically no vanity in it, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a whiteboard behind her covered in anatomical drawings, the working kind, the kind where the drawings are tools rather than illustrations. She was scanning the garage with rapid, systematic attention, and then her eyes landed on Cal, and she went completely still. Still the way people go still when something unexpected turns out to be something they already know. Cal's legal pad was in his hand. His chest had done something his face hadn't caught up to yet. "Cal," her voice came through the speaker across a distance that was more than geographic. "You haven't changed." A pause, quieter. "You're still trying to save everyone." He had not heard Claire Mercer's voice in 7 years. He had not seen her face in 7 years, which was the length of time since Nora's mother, Claire's younger sister, had died in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic, and something else he had never been able to name, while Cal stood in the hallway holding a birth certificate and a death certificate, the two documents existing in proximity that felt like the universe's most brutal piece of punctuation. Claire had left Portland 6 months after the funeral. She had sent a forwarding address. He had written it down and not used it. Not out of anger, grief takes different shapes, and hers had required distance. He understood that much, even if he couldn't see all of it. But the distance had accumulated the way distance does when neither party reaches across it until 7 years had passed, and the forwarding address was somewhere in a drawer he didn't open. Sophie had found Claire through a specialist referral database, working from her phone on the garage floor after the fall, with the focused resourcefulness of a 15-year-old who has decided that if adults won't solve the problem, she will find the adult who can. She had texted the referral number without telling anyone, and the call had connected before anyone had prepared for it. Bridget was watching Cal with an expression that had shifted significantly from its previous configuration. Cal looked at the screen. He looked at Claire's face, older the way everyone's face is older, but recognizably the same person, the same directness in the eyes, the same quality of attention that her sister had also had. The quality of someone who looked at you and actually registered what they saw. He swallowed. "Claire." It came out rough at the edges, which was the most his voice was going to give him in this moment, and he accepted that. Claire looked at the corkboard behind him, at the anatomy texts, at the prototypes on the workbench, at Nora sitting on her milk crate watching all of this with the large-eyed attention of a child who knows something important is happening even without the details. Then she looked back at Cal. "Show me the design," she said, not as a greeting, as the most important thing. He held the legal pad up to the camera and walked her through it. Page by page, the geometry, the load distribution, the failure point in prototype 2. He explained it the way he explained things to Sophie, fully without simplification. And Claire listened the way specialists listen, with the stillness of someone whose understanding is ahead of your explanation and is waiting for you to arrive at the part that matters. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Your concept is right." Her voice had the quality of someone delivering a verdict that is both good news and complicated news. "The alignment theory is correct, but you've been solving it from the wrong end." She paused, and in the pause, Cal felt the anxiety of a man who has spent 3 years on a problem and is about to learn where 3 years of effort has been misdirected. "The balance correction has to originate at the ankle. You've been loading the wrong joint. Everything you've built addresses a compensation pattern. The source is lower." The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent light was audible. Cal closed his eyes. 2 seconds. When he opened them, the geometry had already rearranged itself in his mind around the new anchor point, and the rearrangement made everything click into a coherence it had been missing. The ankle. Of course, the ankle. Every step taken with the X7's misalignment had put the ankle in a compensatory pattern that had then propagated upward through the knee and the hip was where the pain lived, which was why everyone, the promotion specialists, the orthopedic team, 11 years of fitters and adjusters, had been looking at the hip, because that was where the patient reported pain. No one had followed the chain back to where it started. "The ankle," he said. "The ankle," Claire confirmed, and her voice had the kindness of someone giving you the correction you need rather than the comfort you'd prefer. Sophie had been listening from her chair at the edge of the workbench. She was watching two people solve a problem that had been the central fact of her life for 11 years, and her face hadn't decided yet what to do with that. Bridget had sat down on the stool near the office doorway. This was notable because Bridget Ashton did not sit in garages. "I'll call you tomorrow," Cal said to the screen. Claire looked at him for a moment. Professional mode and grief mode coexisting without resolving. "Okay." Then before he could close the laptop, "Cal, she would have been proud of this. No name. No need for one. Just this said, the way you say something you've been holding for a long time and have decided finally to set down." He didn't answer. The call ended. He called her the next morning. They talked for an hour, the ankle correction first, then Portland, then the years between. He called 3 more times after that. She picked up each time. He stood with his hand on the closed laptop, and the garage very quiet around him, and the ankle problem already fully engaged in the part of his mind that didn't stop working. He had $300 in his checking account. The revised design was going to require components he didn't have. He was going to need to be creative about the next 48 hours in a way that was not entirely comfortable. He picked up the legal pad and started over from the ankle. The drone appeared at 1:17 in the morning on a Tuesday, which was the day, and the irony of it registered and was set aside because irony was not a productive response to a drone. Cal heard it before he saw it. The faint mechanical hum at the upper frequency range that drones produce, distinctive enough that once you've heard it, you don't mistake it for anything else. He came around the bay door, and it was hovering at the entrance, approximately 8 feet up, its camera oriented toward the workbench. It held position for 11 seconds. Then it was gone, moving south, its navigation lights disappearing into the fog. Cal stood in the bay door, looking at the space where it had been. He went back inside and looked at the workbench, at the prototypes, at the corkboard with Jesse's photograph and the Promotion X7 patent diagrams he'd printed and annotated, at the legal pads with 3 years of equations. Everything that had been private and unnamed was now documented by whoever was on the other end of that camera. He knew who was on the other end of that camera. The certified letter arrived Thursday. Promotion Corp return address, a law firm in San Francisco with 4 names on the letterhead and a reputation Cal knew by association, the way you know the reputations of certain kinds of organizations without having needed to research them. Unauthorized modification of patented medical devices. Cease and desist. Legal action pending. The language was clean and polished and communicated in the way that corporate legal language communicates things that the organization sending it was prepared to be thorough. He read it twice, folded it, went back to prototype 3. He spent his last $300 on ankle joint components the following morning, which left the account at $11, the number that told him he had fully committed, and there was no resource left to hedge with. He found this clarifying rather than frightening, which probably said something about him. The footage appeared that afternoon. Promotion had edited it into a 70-second clip. Cal's garage, the workbench, the prototype Sophie, and the test brace, with text overlay characterizing what was shown as dangerous and unlicensed medical device modification being performed on a minor. The clip had been submitted to 3 local news aggregators and posted to 2 social media platforms, simultaneously the coordinated move of a company that has run this play before. Cal found out because Ruth knocked on the side door at 4 in the afternoon, holding her phone with the expression of someone whose feelings about the world have just shifted in one clear direction. He watched the clip. The clip was 70 seconds long, and it was intended to be damaging, and it would have been damaging except for one thing that Promotion's editor had apparently not noticed or had noticed and not understood the significance of, or had noticed and miscalculated the audience's response to. In the drone footage at the 31-second mark, there was a 3-second sequence that had nothing to do with Cal or the workbench or the prototypes. It was a shot of Sophie in the garage in the moment between Prototype 2's failure and the fall, the moment when she had pushed herself to standing to attempt the step that had failed. 3 seconds of Sophie Ashton standing on her own 2 feet, unassisted, unsupported, upright. 11 years of paralysis and 9 surgeries and $150,000 of Promotion Corporation's best hardware and a mechanic in Oakland had gotten her standing for 3 seconds. The clip reached 1 million views before 6 o'clock. By 8, it was at 4 million. The comment section moved in one direction, the way crowds move when they find something they agree on completely. The 3 seconds of Sophie standing was the whole story, and the person who had made those 3 seconds happen was not the villain in the narrative Promotion had attempted to construct. By 9:03, local news stations had called the garage number. Cal did not answer any of them. Nora found out about the clip at 9:15 because Ruth came back with her phone this time, with the updated view count, and Nora watched it over Ruth's shoulder with her green sweater and her crooked ponytail, and an expression that moved through recognition, understanding, and a focused anger that was striking on a 7-year-old face before landing somewhere resolute. She went to the back room and came back with the old tablet Cal used for instructional videos. She propped it against a coffee can on the workbench. She sat on her milk crate, pulled her green sweater straight, and started a live stream before Cal had processed what she was doing. He came around the workbench and looked at the screen, which showed the live viewer count climbing past 200. He looked at Nora. She looked at him with an expression that said she understood exactly what she was doing and had decided to do it anyway, and that his opinion on the matter, while valued, was not going to change the outcome. He stepped back. Nora held up the tablet to show the workbench behind her, the lined-up prototypes, the corkboard, the photograph of Jesse at Folsom Lake Waltz documentation pinned alongside the brace schematics. Her voice at the start had the faint tremor of someone running on adrenaline and conviction with insufficient experience in public speaking, but it steadied after the first 2 sentences. "My dad is the kindest person I know." The tremor went. The steadiness that came back was not the steadiness of a performance. It was the steadiness of someone saying something true. And some people want to lock his garage and make him stop helping. So I'm asking you, please don't let them. She held up a piece of poster board she had made at some point in the preceding 20 minutes. The text in blue marker, the letters large and uneven, "Save my dad's garage." Cal was standing 6 feet behind the camera line where the tablet couldn't see him, and the garage was doing that thing. It did sometimes, the light through the one good window at night going warm and specific, the motor oil smell layered underneath everything, like a constant, the radio playing something low and indistinct. And he was watching his 7-year-old daughter do the thing he had never been able to do, which was stand in front of the world and be completely visible. The live stream ran for 11 minutes. When she ended it, the viewer count was past 300,000 and climbing. She set the tablet down and looked at him, and her expression was the expression of someone who has done the thing they decided to do and is now ready to find out how it went. Okay, she asked. Yeah, Cal managed. Okay. 3 million petition signatures arrived over the following 72 hours, the number building with the momentum of something that has found the current that was already moving and is simply riding it. The neighborhood found out the way neighborhoods find out about things that concern one of their own, not all at once but steadily in increments through the specific channels of a community that has a memory. The hardware store 2 blocks down put a handwritten sign in the window. The barber 3 doors over stood in his doorway on 2 consecutive mornings with his white apron and his arms crossed, saying nothing which said everything a man like that needed to say. Walt Grady showed up Saturday morning with a casserole dish his late wife had used for potlucks, and the look of a man who has faced worse odds than this and is not particularly concerned. What do you need? Walt asked. Not what can I do. What do you need? The directness of a man who knows that open offers are harder to accept than targeted ones. Cal showed him the petition numbers on his phone, showed him the view count on Nora's stream, showed him the cease and desist letter, which Walt read with the expression of someone who has seen enough official documents to know exactly what this kind of official document means and what it doesn't mean. They're afraid, Walt said, handing the letter back. Companies don't send these unless they're afraid. 2 days after the drone footage went viral, a white envelope arrived with no return address. Cal opened it at the workbench at 8 in the morning. The letter inside was on Promotion Corp letterhead, but was not from their legal department. It was from their VP of Business Development, whose name Cal recognized from the promotion patent filings he'd been studying for 3 years. The offer was detailed and specific: $2 million, a full licensing agreement that would give Cal's design official promotion certification, and what the letter called appropriate intellectual property attribution, his name on the device in the smaller print. The condition was equally specific: sign the device over, formally, completely, and say nothing about the prior history of the X7 and its misalignment issues, and the 11 years it had spent on Sophie Ashton's body, causing damage that a garage caliper had identified in 30 seconds. Cal read it twice. He put it in the drawer under the workbench, not the drawer with the legal pads, the other one, the one with the items he wasn't sure what to do with yet. He went back to prototype 3. The next morning, Nora came out at 7:45 and went directly to the workbench, which was unusual. Normally, she went to the milk crate. She reached into the drawer Cal hadn't known she knew about and pulled out the white envelope. She didn't open it. She turned it over in her hands, reading the promotion letterhead on the front. Then she went to the corkboard and took down Jesse's photograph with a care that communicated an understanding of what it was. She brought it back and set it on top of the white envelope. She looked at her father. She didn't say anything. She went back to the milk crate and opened her notebook. Cal stood at the workbench looking at the photograph on the envelope for a long moment. Jesse at 22, with the useless fishing rod and the enormous grin, standing in the light at Folsom Lake, with his whole life behind him and what he couldn't know in front of him. He took the envelope out from under the photograph, walked to the side door, and dropped it in the recycling bin. He came back, put Jesse's photograph back on the corkboard at the center of everything, and went back to work on the ankle joint. Prototype 3 came together over 6 days. He worked with the precision that had always been his native mode, but now working with something else alongside it. The clarity that comes from having found the right problem, the sensation of a mechanism that has been fighting itself finally being pointed in the correct direction. The ankle correction propagated through the knee geometry, and then the hip alignment with the clean logic of dominoes falling in the right order. He tested the static load at every stage. He ran the dynamic simulations on the tablet with the cracked screen. He made 14 micro adjustments over the 6 days, each one confirmed by data before he committed it. On the 6th night, he was assembling the final component when the side door knocked. Not a process server. He had been half expecting one for 4 days. The person at the door was a woman in her early 50s, a Stanford faculty lanyard, a laptop under one arm, a folder of printed research under the other, and the slightly undone look of someone who drove 2 hours before deciding what to say. She looked past Cal into the garage at the workbench and the corkboard and the prototypes in their row of revision. I watched the clip 14 times, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone with a lot of professional composure who is currently spending most of it. Then I watched Nora's live stream. Then I drove here because I needed to know if I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Her eyes came back to Cal's face. I was. Her name was Dr. Elaine Frost. Full professor biomechanics and rehabilitation engineering, Stanford School of Medicine, which Cal knew by reputation and by 3 of her papers on the shelf above the anatomy tech's margin notes in his handwriting throughout. She had identified the geometry from drone footage on her laptop and driven 2 hours at 11 at night because she was the kind of person who, when confronted with something true, goes to it. This design is right, she said. It's more than right, actually. Cal looked at her in the doorway of his garage at 11 at night with Prototype 3 on the workbench behind him and 3 million petition signatures on his phone and a recycled offer letter and Jesse's photograph at the center of the corkboard, and something shifted in his chest, not hope exactly, but what hope is built from the feeling of private work making contact with the world. I want to testify at the FDA hearing, Elaine said. Whenever it comes, I'll oversee the full certification process and put my name on it. She held his gaze with the directness of someone making a commitment in real time. All of it. Cal looked at her. The garage light was behind him, the October night was in front of him, and somewhere in the back room, Nora was asleep with a notebook full of designs that were getting better every week, and Jesse's note was in his wallet, and Prototype 3 was waiting on the workbench with the ankle correction finally correct after 3 years of solving the wrong joint. Okay, he said, just that. The same word in the same register that he used when something was agreed and the next thing was to begin. He stepped back from the door and let her in. Prototype 3's first full trial happened on a Wednesday morning, 8 days after Elaine Frost had stood in the garage doorway and committed her name to whatever came next. Cal had been at the workbench since 5 running final checks on the ankle joint mechanism, with the attention of someone who has been wrong twice already and understands precisely what a third failure would cost, not to himself, but to a 15-year-old girl who had trusted him from a concrete floor. Elaine arrived at 8:30 and went directly to the workbench without greeting anyone the way specialists move when they are already inside a problem. She walked the length of Prototype 3 twice crouched to examine the ankle joint from below and straightened up. The load path is clean. The particular flatness of a professional encountering work that meets a standard she respects. This should behave correctly under dynamic load. Should. The word that lives in the gap between confidence and confirmation and means you have done everything right and now reality has to weigh in. Sophie arrived with Bridget at 9. She had developed her own pre-attempt ritual across the previous trials. The chin lift, the internal accounting, the deliberate checking in with each part of herself that she'd built over years of her body producing surprises. She did this at the edge of the garage floor while Cal made final fitting adjustments, and Nora sat on her milk crate with her notebook open and pencil ready, and Elaine stood at the workbench with her tablet propped to record gate data, and Bridget positioned herself at the far end of the garage in the place she'd chosen for the previous trials, far enough to give Sophie room close enough. The ankle joint seated correctly. The contact points distributed load the way the design required. Cal checked alignment 3 times and stepped back. Sophie stood. The transfer from the chair was the same practice motion it had always been, but what happened after it was different, and the different was visible immediately in her posture, in the way force moved through her skeleton from the floor upward, in the way her shoulders settled rather than braced. She stood with the quality of a person whose body has found a configuration it recognizes as correct, and is taking a moment to understand that recognition, the way you pause when you hear a word in another language that you somehow already know. 1 step. Even smooth, no compensation catch. 2 steps. The gate level. 3. Her face was doing something that had no ready name in any vocabulary Cal knew, not wonder exactly, but the stage before wonder when the body has already understood something the mind is still catching up to. 4 steps, 5, 6. The shoulders level, the chin lifted in the small habitual way. 7, 8. Walking the way walking is supposed to feel, which meant walking the way she had never felt it, and that understanding arrived with its full complicated weight. The understanding that this was what other people had been experiencing all along unremarkably every ordinary day. 10 steps. She stopped. She looked down at her feet on the concrete floor. The garage held its breath. Nora was not erupting. She had her notebook pressed against her chest with both hands, and her eyes were too bright, and she was completely still in the way that very young people go, still when they recognize that a moment is larger than their usual response to it. Elaine was watching the tablet screen with the expression of a scientist watching data confirm what she staked her credibility on, the specific, quiet satisfaction of being right about something that mattered. Bridget was at the far end of the garage, and she was not steady. Her phone was at her side untouched. Her free hand was flat against her sternum, pressing there. And everything she had spent 11 years managing, the controlled posture, the professional surface, the architecture of a woman who had learned to treat her own grief as a logistics problem, had come down, and what was underneath it was just a mother looking at her daughter standing on 2 feet without pain for the first time in 11 years. Sophie turned and walked back. 10 more steps, return journey, the gate identical to the first pass. Consistent, correct, earned. She sat back into her chair by choice, and she looked at Cal, and the dark eyes that had always been careful were fully open. It doesn't hurt. She said it the way you say something in a language you are learning for the first time, testing whether the words are real. It doesn't hurt at all. Cal looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Jesse's photograph on the corkboard. He picked up the legal pad and wrote down the data, because writing down the data was what you did, and because it gave his hands something to do, while the rest of him caught up to what had just happened in his garage. Promotion's legal team filed the full injunction package on a Thursday, 3 days after the trial. Permanent closure, compensatory damages, a polished statement about patient safety and unlicensed practice that read considerably less well when placed beside footage of Sophie Ashton walking 20 steps across a concrete floor. But Promotion had calculated, not incorrectly, that legal mechanisms run on a different track than public sentiment and don't always intersect in time to matter. Elaine called at 7 the morning the papers arrived. She had already spoken to 3 colleagues on the FDA Orthopedic Device Review Panel and submitted a preliminary technical brief. Her voice had the quality of someone who has identified a fight and is several moves in. They filed because they're losing the public narrative. The legal route is slower than the conversation, but they're betting it outlasts the attention span. A pause. I'm betting against them. She called again 2 days later, and her voice had shifted into something more electric, the register of a person who has found the thing that ends the argument. She had spent 48 hours cross-referencing Cal's design documentation against Promotion's patent filings. The dated legal pads, the archived tablet files, the time-stamped prototype photographs, 14 months of prior documentation, all of it predating Promotion's patent application. The patent's joint geometry was an 80% match to Cal's recorded designs. Not developed in parallel, not independent innovation. They had been watching the garage long before the drone, feeding his design data into a filing that they then used as the legal basis to shut him down. Cal, Elaine's voice had the weight of something that cannot be unsaid once it is said. You are the inventor. They are the theft. He stood in the garage with the phone at his ear, and the morning light coming through the one good window, and the full implication rearranging the past 18 months into a different shape. The offer letter he'd put in the recycling bin. The drone that had been one visible moment in something longer and more deliberate. They had known what his work was worth because they had been reading his legal pads for over a year. He looked at Jesse's photograph for a long time. Then he put the phone down and went back to the workbench, because the answer to what Elaine had just told him was not a conversation. It was the work continued. The FDA hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a federal building in San Francisco, the old carpet institutional coffee variety that communicates it was built to process serious things and has been doing so without complaint for decades. Cal drove himself. Elaine had been there since 7. Sophie and Bridget arrived separately. Cal sat in the hallway outside the hearing room for 20 minutes before it began. He had the legal pads in a folder and Jesse's receipt in his pocket, and the stillness of a man who has prepared as completely as preparation allows and has arrived at the place where preparation ends. Elaine's testimony ran 40 minutes. She presented Cal's documentation in chronological order, establishing authorship with the precision that 14 months of dated records made possible. She walked the panel through the X7's misalignment, the 10-degree hip joint error, the compensatory cascade it had produced through the knee and up to the hip, the 11 years of pain that had been the downstream consequence of a starting error that should have been caught at the first fitting. She presented promotion's patent in the 80% geometric overlap with Cal's prior documented work, and she let the numbers speak in the way numbers speak when they are correct and the audience is capable of understanding them. Then she showed the two videos. The first was Sophie at the final trial, 20 steps across the garage floor. The gate, even the chin lifted the face doing its recalibration. The second was Walt Grady, 76 years old, walking from his kitchen counter to his refrigerator and back, pausing in the middle of his own linoleum to pick up a coffee mug with both hands, setting it down, looking at the camera with the expression of a man recovering something he had privately stopped believing he would have again. When the second video ended, the room stood up. Not organized, not rehearsed. The spontaneous kind, the kind that happens before the people standing have decided to stand, propelled by something that operates below the level of decision. Panel members, attorneys, gallery observers, all of them, and the sound of it filling the hearing room with the quality of a response that cannot be argued with, because it is not an argument. Cal was sitting at the respondents' table, and he did not stand with them. He looked at his hands on the folder, the scarred knuckles, the permanent engine oil lines, the hands of a man who had fixed things because there was no one else to fix them, and had kept fixing things long after the original reason had deepened into something else. The double doors at the back opened. Sophie came through them fast, not the careful test-step pace of the trials, but the run of a person whose body has remembered something and is expressing that memory with everything it has. 20 meters down the center aisle, her hair moving with the speed of it, and she hit Bridget's arms at the front of the room with enough force that they both staggered back 2 steps, and Bridget held on with the force of 11 years behind it. The room went quiet. The particular quiet of a space where something has happened that is larger than the occasion it was scheduled for. Sophie pulled back just far enough to look at her mother's face. Bridget's face had fully surrendered its management, the tears running without containment, the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been relieved of it all at once. "Mom." Sophie's voice broke on the word, the way voices break when they are carrying more than voice can hold, and then came back clear and level the way her voice always found its way back. "I forgive you. I forgive you because of him." Bridget pulled her back in and held on, and the sound she made was the real kind, not quiet, not managed, with nothing performed in it. Cal was looking at his folder. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing they did when the specific place in his chest where he kept things was working at full capacity. He breathed in the careful way. He let it out. Then Bridget did something that no one in the room anticipated, including herself. She released Sophie and straightened up, and she turned to face the panel, and her voice when she spoke had the quality of a woman who has decided to spend something she cannot get back. "I need to make a statement, not a request." The panel chair nodded after a beat. Bridget Ashton, CEO, 34 years old, stood in the hearing room and told the panel that she had known the promotion X7 had a misalignment issue. Not since the beginning, she was clear about the timeline. She had received an internal memo in year 3 of Sophie's treatment, flagged by a promotion engineer who had since left the company, suggesting that the X7's hip joint geometry was producing anomalous load distribution in a subset of patients. She had raised it with the company. They had provided reassurances and revised documentation, and she had accepted both because accepting them was easier than the alternative, and because the alternative meant dismantling the structure she had built around managing Sophie's care, and she had not been ready to dismantle it. She had signed a $40 million partnership agreement with Promotion 14 months after receiving that memo. She said all of this in the flat, clear voice of someone delivering a verdict about themselves that they have already accepted. She did not soften it. She did not contextualize it toward sympathy. She said what had happened and what she had done and what it had cost her daughter. And she stood there while she said it with her hands at her sides and the expression of a woman who is paying a debt she has owed for 8 years and is not going to negotiate the terms. The room was very still when she finished. Cal was looking at her from the respondents' table. He had not known. Nobody in the room had known, including Promotion's attorneys, whose composure underwent a visible recalibration. The statement had just made their patent defense considerably more complicated and their patient safety argument structurally untenable, and they understood this at the same speed that Cal understood something else, that what Bridget had just done had cost her more than the $40 million she'd signed, and more than whatever legal exposure she just created. It had cost her the version of herself she'd been maintaining for 8 years, and she had spent it voluntarily in public for Sophie. He looked at Sophie. Sophie was looking at her mother with the dark eyes fully open, and in them was something that had not been there before. Not forgiveness, she'd already given that, but something adjacent to awe. The panel's formal determination came 12 days later. Promotion's injunction was denied. Their patent application was flagged for prior art investigation. Elaine's certification pathway was approved. The garage could operate, and more than that, the work could continue in a form that the law would now protect rather than threaten. Cal read the letter at the workbench at 6 in the morning, set it down and made coffee. Bridget called that afternoon. Her voice was different from any version he'd heard, quieter, with the quality of someone who has come through a significant recalibration and is still finding their footing in the new configuration. "I want to fund the center," she said. "The full build-out, the equipment, the lease, the certification costs. 10 million. Name it whatever you want." The pause on Cal's end ran long enough that Bridget checked the connection. The moment this becomes a transaction, it stops being what it is. He said it evenly without judgment because he meant it as a statement of fact rather than a rebuke. "Let me do this my way first. If we need help down the road, I'll ask." A silence that had the quality of someone adjusting, not withdrawing, but recalibrating to a frame she hadn't been operating in. "All right, but I'm going to find a way to be useful." She did, quietly without announcement. A foundation began channeling support supplies, warehouse rent equipment through channels that listed no individual name. Cal found out through a misfiled document 3 months in, looked at the foundation name for a moment, set the document down, and went back to work. He never mentioned it to her. She never mentioned it to him. This became something they held in silence, which was its own form of understanding between two people who had learned that some things are communicated more completely without words. The warehouse was 2 blocks from the garage, converted with high ceilings and wide doorways, and rubber flooring that absorbed impact quietly. Cal had specified the flooring himself because he understood from the trials what the sound of a fall does to the people in a room when someone is attempting something that has failed before. He installed the coffee pot before anything else, before the equipment, before the certification paperwork was fully processed. The coffee pot was running on the first morning. This seemed correct to him. He built the sign from dark walnut, hand-routed, the kind you find above a library, in a small town that has been in the same building long enough to earn its permanence. He measured it 3 times, cut it twice, sanded it on a Saturday afternoon, while Nora sat in the transferred milk crate and offered opinions on letter spacing that were more useful than he'd expected. He hung it on a Tuesday morning, standing on a ladder in the early November light, and when he stepped down and looked up at it, the name had the rightness of words that have been earned rather than chosen. Harper Mobility Center, in memory of Jesse Harper. He put the ladder away and opened the doors. The knock came at 9:40, before the first patient, before Elaine arrived with certification paperwork, before Nora had finished arranging the bowl of wrapped peppermints on the front desk. Cal was at the workbench reviewing second-generation ankle joint refinements when he heard it. He opened the door. Claire Mercer was standing on the sidewalk in the November morning with a laptop bag over one shoulder and a cardboard box under her arm. She was wearing a coat he didn't recognize. Her silver hair was slightly undone from the drive reading glasses on her forehead, in the same position they'd occupied on the laptop screen when she'd appeared in the garage 8 weeks earlier, the night Sophie had called her from the floor. After that call, he had dialed her the next morning, as he'd said he would, and they had talked for an hour about the ankle correction, first then about Portland, about the years, about the particular way two people who have lost the same person can exist in the same grief without being able to reach each other across it. They had talked 3 more times after that, each call moving incrementally from professional to something older and more real. He had not known she was coming today. She had not told him. She looked at the sign above the door. She took her time with it, reading the letters in the November light. Then she looked at him. She held out the box. It was a shoe box, old, the corners reinforced with careful tape. He took it. Heavier than it should have been. "After the service, I didn't know what you needed, and I couldn't ask." Her voice was the voice of someone delivering something they have carried for a long time and have thought about the delivery of carefully. "And then I left, and it left with me." I've been waiting for the right time. He opened the box at the workbench. Photographs. Loose the way photographs accumulate in a life that is being lived. He recognized the surface layer immediately. Birthdays, a road trip somewhere in Oregon, the front porch of the Ashby apartment with the broken railing. Underneath those, a photograph he had never seen his wife in the third trimester standing in a garage. Not this garage, a different one. A rented space in Berkeley where he'd worked weekends during his second year, laughing at something outside the frame, her hand resting on a workbench at exactly the position where the legal pads lived now. He stood with the photograph in both hands and did not speak. The warehouse was quiet. The coffee was running. Jesse's photograph was on the wall above the new workbench, moved from the corkboard that morning, watching all of it. Nora had come in from the front room. She was at his elbow looking into the box, and then she was looking at the photograph in his hands with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered. "Is that Mom?" The careful voice of a child asking a question that has been waiting a long time. Claire crouched to Nora's level. She looked at her, at the eyes which were the same quality of looking at the world and actually registering it, and her expression did something large and specific that had no single name. "Yes, baby." Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been through enough to find their own level. "That's your mom." Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked up at Cal. Her face had the expression of someone receiving something they had organized themselves around, not expecting, and are now reorganizing around having it, which is not a painful process, but is a significant one. She reached into the box and took the photograph from Cal's hands carefully with both hands, the way Nora handled things that mattered. Cal could not speak. The machinery between feeling and language had stopped in the way he recognized as temporary and necessary. He looked at the sign above the door. He looked at Jesse. He looked at Nora holding her mother's image with both hands in the center of the room he had built in memory of the people he had lost, and in service of the people he could still reach. There is a kind of fullness that cannot be distinguished from weight, and he was carrying both, and the warehouse held it with him. Claire stood. She put her hand briefly on his arm, the contact of someone who knows that words would be either too much or too small, and then she moved to the workbench and opened her laptop and pulled up the certification files because she was a professional, and there were patients scheduled at 10, and the best way she knew to honor a thing was to work alongside it. He stood for another moment. Then he wiped his face once briefly in the private way. He put Jesse's receipt back in his wallet. He went to the workbench and stood beside Claire and looked at the files, and after a moment he picked up his caliper, and they began. The first year of the Harper Mobility Center held 200 patients. Walt Grady came in on a Wednesday with a casserole dish he said a center needed and left on the front desk next to the peppermints. He stayed afterwards sitting with the parents of a 9-year-old named Ethan, who had been in rigid bracing since age 5, and he talked about his hip and the cane and what it felt like to walk to the refrigerator without it. He talked plainly the way men talk when they want another person to know something is real and survivable. The boy's fitting took an afternoon. He took 4 steps, stopped, looked at his feet with the same confused, recalibrating expression that Cal had now seen enough times to understand was the face a body makes when a long-held assumption turns out to be wrong. And then the revision arrived, and what came with it was laughter. The kind that happens when relief is so complete, it has nowhere else to go. His mother sat in the waiting room with her face in her hands for a full minute while Cal sat beside her, because he had learned that sitting beside people was not the absence of help, but a form of it. Sophie came on Saturdays. She was enrolled in a pre-med program, which she mentioned in the flat declarative way she mentioned things that were enormous, and then watched people's faces go quiet when the enormity landed. In the waiting room, she talked with the children about what years in a brace felt like, and she drew joint diagrams on appointment cards, and she answered the hard questions the same way she answered the easy ones. She was very good at it. Nora had begun watching how she did it, which Cal noticed and did not comment on. Nora's notebook designs had migrated to the secondary workbench as working documents. The hip rotation component she'd drawn in purple crayon the October morning before the Rolls-Royce arrived had evolved through 4 iterations into a genuine design element incorporated into the 3rd-generation device. Nora accepted this as the natural order of things because she had always understood the drawings were functional rather than expressive, and being treated as functional was simply reality operating correctly. Elaine came 3 days a week. She ran the certification program above the level she had committed, to which Cal had come to understand was her native mode. She operated above her own stated standard, the way some people simply do. His official certification exam happened on a Thursday morning in a quiet room with questions about joint mechanics, material tolerances, and load distribution questions he had been answering in practice for 3 years before anyone had thought to formalize the asking. He passed with marks that made Elaine pause on the phone. "You didn't tell me you'd read Norden and Frankel, both editions." A pause with surprise genuinely in it. Then she laughed, the real kind arrived without preparation. "None of this should have surprised me." Ruth came in 6 weeks after the opening, good coat folded in her lap. Cal worked an hour on her adjustment, and she talked, really talked about her husband and his hips and the 6 years of pain he'd kept private, and she'd found out about afterward, the particular grief of disclosure that comes too late to be useful. When he finished and helped her to her feet, she walked to the window where the afternoon light came through at the low November angle. She stood looking at the street for a moment. When she spoke, she didn't turn around. "You've healed this whole neighborhood, son, without it even knowing it needed healing." Cal stood behind her with the worn caliper in his hand. He did not say anything. Some moments are not asking for a response. They are asking for a witness, someone present and attending, which is the oldest form of care, and the one that requires the most of the person giving it. They drove to Lake Tahoe on the first Saturday of November, Bridget driving Sophie in the passenger seat, Cal and Nora in the back. Nora slept past Sacramento with her cheek on the window and her notebook across her knee. She woke the instant the lake appeared below them with the sudden alertness of a child whose interior sense for significant things operates even through sleep. "It looks like a painting." The complete authority of a 7-year-old encountering something large and beautiful for the first time. "It does," Cal agreed. "Does the painting have hot chocolate?" "We'll find some after." They parked at the trailhead and walked to the clearing. Bridget knew the location with the precise and terrible accuracy of information carried for 11 years. The slope, the ridge, the exact stretch of flat ground at the bottom, the coordinates of the moment when she had been on a call 50 feet away and had not looked up. She had told Cal about the call 6 weeks after the hearing in the waiting room, at the end of a Saturday when the last patient had gone. She had told him plainly without architecture because the architecture had come down, and she had found that what was on the other side of it was harder and more bearable than what it had been protecting. He had understood what she meant in the way he understood things that were too large to respond to with words by receiving them fully and saying nothing and letting that be enough. Now she stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the slope, and her face held the quality of someone who has been dreading a place for years and is discovering that the place is just a place and the weight was never in the geography. Sophie stepped out and stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, doing her inventory, the deliberate checking in with each part of herself that had started as coping and become something closer to a practice. Then she simply began to move, slowly at first, then steadier. Then she was running. The snow crunched clean and sharp. The cold air off the lake moved her hair sideways. She ran across the clearing with the full commitment of a body that has remembered something the mind had filed under, lost, not tentatively, not monitoring, but completely the way you do a thing when you no longer have to think about it. She was laughing before she reached the center of the field, the loose and unguarded kind that has nothing calculated in it, the laughter of someone proven wrong about something fundamental and finding the being wrong purely uncomplicatedly good. She ran to the far edge and stopped and turned her face red from the cold, her eyes full. She put everything she had into her voice across the distance of the clearing and the cold, brilliant air between them. "Uncle Cal, thank you for asking that question that day." The echo moved across the lake, and the pines held it for a moment in the way that large things hold sound and then let it go. Cal stood at the near edge of the clearing with Nora beside him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing what they did when the place in his chest where he kept things was working at its limit. He looked up at the November sky over Tahoe, the specific blue of altitude, in that specific month wide and still and deeply cold, the kind of sky that has been there long before any of this, and will be there long after, and doesn't mean anything by it and means everything by it. His lips moved, just breath with shape to it. Jesse, we did it. Nora took his hand. Not the squeeze of a child seeking comfort, but the deliberate grip of someone communicating something specific without making a production of it. He looked down at her. She was watching Sophie at the far edge of the clearing, standing in the snow with the cold air in her hair, alive in the full sense of the word, and Nora's face had the expression it wore when things were precisely as they should be. She looked up at him. I'm so proud of you, Dad. He held her hand. He looked back at the sky. The lake was still. The pines along the ridge held their snow with the patience of things that have been through many Novembers. Bridget had crossed the clearing and was standing a few feet away, not speaking, present in the way that people are present when they have nothing left to perform and nothing left to protect, which is the most complete form of presence there is. Cal looked at her. She looked at him. Between them was the full weight of what one question had set in motion, asked on a Tuesday in October, to a stranger in a garage doorway, asked without calculation, asked because a girl was biting her lip, and he had learned through years of losses he couldn't fix, and one he could, that the most important thing you can do for another person is notice them and ask. He reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. He took out the gas station receipt. Jesse's handwriting faded to near nothing. At the folds, the paper worn thin from years of being opened and closed in the specific way of things that are both feared and needed. He looked at it one more time. The 4 lines he had long since stopped needing to read. He folded it along its worn lines. Put it back. He kept it. He would always keep it. Not because he needed the reminder anymore. He had become the reminder, the thing Jesse had asked him to be, built out of grief and work, and 3 words asked on a Tuesday, to a girl who had been hoping without saying so that someone would see her. But because some things are not for putting down, some things you carry not as burden, but as ballast, the weight that keeps you oriented, that tells you which way is up when the water gets rough. Nora's hand was in his. Sophie was standing in the snow at the far edge of the clearing, breathing the cold air, her face turned toward them, alive in every direction. The lake held the light the way it held the echo for a moment, generously, and then releasing it into the wide November sky. Cal Harper stood in all of it and breathed.